I'm Steve Jencks. I've been in quality improvement for years and years and years. And I wanted to talk to you now about a bite-sized piece of information or wisdom that has become very important as the quality improvement enterprise has moved along. Let's call this the Fable of Perfection. Once upon a time, about 20 years ago, long after the pros began to turn into QIOs, people began to look at timeliness of care in emergency rooms. And any of us who's been in an emergency room can understand why they were worried about timeliness. They began to look in particular at how much time passed from the arrival of a patient in the emergency department to the initiation of care, and specifically for pneumonia, time from arrival in the emergency department to the beginning of antibiotics. What they found was that about 15% of pneumonia patients were waiting more than 8 hours for antibiotics. And nobody really thought they could defend this as good practice. So here we were with a problem. And what happened? Well, the first thing that happened was that this was publicized, and the results were widely promulgated. QIOs went and spoke to many, many hospitals. And in a couple of years, a follow-up study was published. The percentage of patients who were waiting more than 8 hours decreased, but they decreased from 15% to 13%. A lot of people had believed that if institutions only knew these problems, they would fix them. And the people who felt that way felt very sad about the slow progress. So the next thing that happened, many things happened, was that Premier came to CMS and said, our hospitals will improve care a lot if we can provide some rewards. So Premier agreed with CMS as to how this was to happen, and they provided the rewards. And the timeliness of antibiotics with pneumonia became very much better. Indeed, it became so much better that the rewards could be lost by having one patient who waited more than 8 hours. A single missed deadline was enough to keep a hospital from getting a reward. So now, performance in the most successful hospitals in Premier was pretty nearly perfect by this measure. And this is where the learning begins, because we began to hear stories that were not quite so reassuring. The first story that began to emerge was of patients who looked as if they might have pneumonia, but didn't. But it turned out they got antibiotics too, just to make sure the deadline was not missed. And at the same time, other stories began to emerge about hospitals that were putting nurses full-time on monitoring the care to make sure that none of the things on which they might get rewards would be missed. Now, the problem, of course, was that that didn't necessarily mean that everything else was done perfectly. But this process did produce results, and it was expensive, and it was inefficient, but it was worth the reward. And the third thing that happened was that a bunch of professionals who were very serious about improving care began to be seriously concerned that this was not what they had had in mind. that an obsessive focus on one measure just was wrong. And so what happened next was that people began to look at what was going on. Now, the moral of this fable is a little complicated. Parts are simple. The first of these parts is that it is worth asking how perfect you want to be. And when you ask that question, you need to have two things in mind. One is familiar. That is the cost of having people running around checking charts, checking numbers, and contributing not much to the actual improvement of care, because care is by this time very good anyway. But the second part of this moral is more important than some, and that is that most measures are imperfect. They have false positives and false negatives. And if you create a system where the whole aim is to avoid having false negatives, that is, the whole aim is to avoid not treating somebody who should be treated, then what you're going to do is treat people who don't need to be treated. Maintaining that balance is a real challenge with process of care measures. And pursuing perfection can really have a third effect, which is that it's not very good for morale if you're pursuing more perfection than the clinicians think makes sense. They begin to say, we're just counting beans. We're not improving care. And so we need to sort of take the fourth moral from this, which is in some ways the hardest one to get people to be reasonable about. And that is that it's not a sufficient reason for doing something that's not very smart to be able to say that CMS told you to do it, or the Joint Commission told you to do it, or somebody else told you to do it. You need ultimately to come back to exercising good clinical judgment. Now, given that, what do we do? Because you're not going to say either that it's all right to constantly not get the care to the patient or not do what you intended to do. First of all, you have to keep in mind that the move toward measuring outcomes, which is very strong, has more logic to it than just counting the number of things that are important. That is, we're not just moving toward counting survival or kidney failure or injuries, rather than counting the number of people who get their medications all the time in order to have something that's more meaningful to patients. We're also doing it because it permits us to get past a lot of judgment calls that it's very hard to get made right if you're doing process of care measures. Process of care measures have been built into the DNA of the care. But a lot of folks, and that would include CMS, possibly the Joint Commission, are beginning to realize that they are only a part of the story. What we're being pressed to do is to go to the things that matter because they get out of rules that are too rigid for the science that lies beneath. So now let's just try to sum this up to get your teeth and jaws around this bite-sized learning. And talk about the idea that process of care measures were especially useful when we were starting to do clinical quality improvement and where we really needed to have things that had a solid science foundation under them and on which we were very confident we could achieve improvement. But the quality movement has evolved. It's evolved a lot. We're taking on far more challenging issues like patient evaluations of their care, readmissions, and a lot of outcomes. For example, surgery and medical care as well. That shift is something you need to be aware of, because when your DNA tells you that you're not doing what you learned to do when you were in medical school or nursing school, the message is right, but it may be a good thing rather than a bad thing. And I wish you luck in making it work. Thank you.